Focus on Summertown. This is the first in what we hope will be a series about Summertown, both past and present. Summertown had many faces over the years. At one time, Summertown was known as a summer resort, and Summertown was also known as a railroad hub, a small mining community, as most of us have come to know Summertown as a quiet, restful little community. In this series, we're going to discuss several different subjects, from the early layout of the community to the schools of Summertown, also the churches of Summertown, and some of the older families that lived around here. We're also going to explore some businesses and the people who made the news back in the early days. Today we're going to explore the early school life in Summertown. And to help us with this, we have a lifelong resident of Summertown, Mr. Flavil Bottoms. Welcome, Mr. Bottoms, to our show.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Flavil Bottoms once taught school in Summertown. He was principal of school here, and Mr. Bottoms was a long-time postmaster of the Postal Service in Summertown. And Mr. Bottoms has seen a drastic change in Summertown over the last several years. Mr. Bottoms, what year did you come to Summertown?
We came here, or I did, in 1925. My parents moved here, and we began to clear up a wooded area out here where that was to become our home. And in 1925, I finished my second year of school, high school, at Leoma with Mr. Napoleon Lumpkins as principal. We had just moved here from New Mexico and western Texas, where most of my high school work at that time had been completed. And my father owned about 70-something acres of land out here near Crestview, as it was called then. And I, being the oldest of the boys, was his main helper in clearing up this land and building our first house there.
How many brothers and sisters did you have, Mr. Bottoms?
I had two brothers, one of which is still living, and three sisters. They're all living.
And your parents worked with the woods, in the woods then?
Yes. My father was a carpenter. He through a number of years, I guess, he ran a mill, grist mill, at our home place down there, and ground corn and wheat and all sorts of stuff like that for neighbors and friends all over the north end of the county.
Exactly where was your house located as we know it now?
Well, as we know it now, it was located in the forks of the road between Highway 31 and Highway 20, where they fork off.
Out we know it as the forks of the road.
Yes.
Okay, and you run the business around there. And what do you first remember about school here in Summertown?
This was a fairly large elementary school, and had 3 rooms. The building was located just slightly west of where the present elementary school is now located. We had no gymnasiums. Our water came from a well there near the building. A few years later, a pump was inserted at the springs down here, and a well house was built there. A line was dug all the way up here, and we had our first running water in I guess it was in the middle 30s.
All right. But in the early 20s, you had to draw water out of a bucket, right, like we all did at home.
That's exactly the way it was.
How many rooms do you remember is in the first school here?
This school had 3 rooms, 2 north rooms running east and west, and the south room was later used as the home economics room for the high school. When the high school, when the first brick school rather it was built here, they did as nearly all communities did at that time. They built it too small. We had 6 rooms and an auditorium, and almost immediately that school was overcrowded. the old elementary school, or the old Ader School, which was built certainly back in the 1800s. I have a record of it being here in 1888, and it was a rather old school at that time.
Do you remember who the first principal was at Summertown School?
No, I don't. There are no available records that I know of. There might be a few records in the county superintendent's office, but as far as I know, there's no one here living at this time and I don't suppose there's anybody that could go back. If there could, I'd sure be glad to hear from them.
Yeah. They probably not. Well, do you remember in the 1920s who the principal was in the school?
Yes, Mr. Herbert Turpin was the principal teacher. Miss Carrie Dooley, who later married Fred Usher, was the middle grades, and Miss Kitty Dunn was the primary teacher.
Miss Kitty Dunn was still teaching when I went to school, which was some years later.
Miss Kitty Dunn lived to be quite old, and that school teaching school was her life, and she enjoyed it. We were fortunate in having three, I think, of the best teachers anywhere here. I didn't know about this school until when I finished when I finished my second year at Leoma. My father, and neither was I, able to go to Lawrenceburg and be boarded down there. So it was a question of my going to work or dropping out of school. I really didn't like the idea of dropping out of school, but I did in 24 and 25. I did go to Florida and worked 2 winters down there picking oranges and working in the pine woods down there.
Had to work your way through school then. You spoke of boarding school. No further away than Lawrenceburg was. It was hard to get there, wasn't it? You had to board. It
was hard to get there. There was no transportation in those days like we have now. As a matter of fact, these roads through here in many times were not passable. Most of the traffic over the roads in those days, they were not cars, they were wagons and buggies, and they really cut a road down in the wintertime during heavy freezes and thaws.
And they were just 2-lane buggy trails, about all there were.
That's right. And you had to stay in Lawrenceburg. You had to pay board. Of course, it wasn't much. Board wasn't high then. I don't know what it was, $4 or $5 a week, something like that. But now when you remember the times that we had just following World War I and the great crash in '29, money was a scarce item around this part of the country, and I suppose it was everywhere.
$3 or $4 was like maybe $4,000 or $5,000 today.
It sure was. When I first taught school and I began teaching, I think in '32, they gave me $50 a month, and the county was not able to finance the schools, and they'd give you a voucher, and you had to find somebody that would buy that voucher, and it cost me $5 a month, and we had 8-month schools back in those days, but it cost me $5 a month to get my voucher cashed, and this man would hold this voucher until the county was able to appropriate enough money to take care of the indebtedness for that the teachers had occurred for the past few months. Well, I suppose they did it on a yearly basis. I don't know.
They had to run the expense and then pay the bill, appropriate the money and pay the bill.
That's right.
Well, in the 20s and the 30s, how did the students dress going to school in those days?
Well, I have an old picture made of our school in 1928, I believe it was, and I was a little bit amazed to find that most of us dressed almost like we did when we were at home. We just had on blue jeans. Of course, they were usually cleaner, I suppose, those we wore to school than what we wore around the house.
And no shoes, probably.
And a lot of times, no shoes.
Well, Mr. Bottoms, we're going to have to break in and have a word from our sponsor, and we'll have a discussion later on. We'll be back in 1 minute. We're discussing the early school life in Summertown with Mr. Flavil Bottoms. Well, Mr. Bottoms, I believe we've almost got up to your high school years.
Yes, that's right. When I finished high school, finished the second year of high school at Leoma with Mr. Lumpkins, he inspired me to not let that be all. And when I came here to live at home, and my brother, younger than he was going to school, and I had wasted in the you might say nearly 2 years of my early adult life, I had wasted it.
That was the years you went to Florida and worked.
Years I went to Florida. And Mr. Herbert Turpin was teacher here, and I decided I would go to school and take the third year. Well, maybe I took the second year over again, just I had nothing else to do. So I started to school here, and he was an inspiration to me, or Herbert Turpin was, and he gave us hope that soon there would be a place in the north end of the county and in the south end also where we wouldn't have to go to Lawrenceburg to school, but we could stay at home and go to school.
That was a big undertaking at that time to think about a school in Summertown, wasn't it?
That's right. Now, when you go to a high school here, that means you gotta transport children from, say, Center, Henryville, Freedom, all north of Etheridge. You've got to transport them in. Most of them had no way of going except walking or riding a horse or a buggy or something like that. But the roads really were not in any shape for bus transportation.
Well, that transportation brings in another subject now. All right, we had our first bus. What did our first school bus consist of, and who operated this bus?
Our first bus here was Mr. Will Holloway built this. It was on a Chevrolet, sort of a long bed chassis, and it was built by the body of it was built. I suppose he built it, and he transported the children. Went into the Center, Red Hill, crossed to Etheridge, picked them up here at Henryville, and came in through Freedom, I guess, picking up the high school, the freshmen and sophomores. And
this was a long journey at that time. I imagine it started before daylight.
That's right. That's right. Exactly right. And when this bus route was established, it encouraged the road commissioner to fix certain roads. Certainly the roads where the rural carriers would be carrying the mail, and also where the bus route would be. They were, and they did go to work on it. They went to church in these roads, and there was big improvement made almost immediately. There was little or no blacktopping in those days, except the road was blacktopped in the late 20s between Columbia and Florence, Alabama, or the state line, down here below St. Joe. Now the roads did improve due to the fact that there was great necessity for that, because it was nothing for the bus to get stuck way out in some swamp and have to have somebody with a tractor or with a team of mules to come help him get going.
I imagine all the big hard ankle high school boys kept it pushed out of the minor holes, didn't
that's right. That's right. They were quite helpful.
All right. Our first high school building in Summertown, do you remember what year it was built and the location?
The first high school building, the building was used both as an elementary and a high school. It had the very first one was built in 1927-28. And it had 3 rooms on the east wing, 3 rooms on the west wing, and a large auditorium that was used as a classroom. But even as I said in the beginning, the school building was too small. And before the next year rolled around, which had been 28, I guess, there was 2 rooms built, one on either wing, on the southern part of both wings. And in later years, 2 more rooms built on the north side of each wing.
All right, this school is...
But this high school here, that was the high school until about 36 or 37, I guess. I wouldn't, unless I had some records, I couldn't be sure. But that is about 36, I guess. The first high school was built, and it stood almost exactly where the present high school stands, except it was not nearly so large.
Yeah, just a small building to
Yes.
start with. Do you remember how this school was financed, or what came about the financing on the school?
The first brick building we had here was financed by not only the county, but the community people made a contribution. There was people who were vitally interested in it. My father, of course, was. Mr. Lowell Crane's father, who was magistrate here at one time and ran a general store here. Oh, there was a number of people who were interested, and they began to circulate petitions all over the north end of the county asking people to give all they thought they could afford to give. They didn't have to put down cash because there was no way most of them could get cash in 1927, 8, and 9. It was a slow process. But anyway, they pledged themselves to pay so much, and I suppose they did, because almost immediately, I believe it was in 27, they began to work here, and the building was completed within a year or less time, I'm sure, and it was used both as a high school and as an elementary school. Although we got to remember that when we went into the new building, there was only, when the year we went in, there was an 11th grade. Mr. Wheeler Jurgen was elected principal. Mr. Herbert Turpin, due to the ill health of his father at Bonnertown, left the school teaching for a few years and went there to help out in his father-in-law's business. And Wheeler Jurgen came in here as principal and stayed 1 year. Now, Mr. Turpin was such a he was a powerful man in my eyes as a kid, because he was a person that could get things done. When Mr. Wheeler Jurgen, who was a different personality altogether, more reserved, I didn't know wasn't familiar with the community. He was a very unpopular man. He was a good principal, but he wasn't accepted following Mr. Turpin.
When you have a good man, it's hard for the next man to come in line and take up where he left off.
That's right, and he stayed here only 1 year. And the following year we had a senior class, which was 29-30. We had a senior class, and Noah Turpin, which was a younger brother of Herbert, came here and taught. I believe he taught 3 years, beginning at the 29-30. And the first graduating class, Mr. Noah Turpin was the principal.
Do you remember how many students was in the first graduating class of
Yes.
Summertown High School?
We had 9. We had 5 boys and 4 girls. 3 of the girls are still living, and 2 of the boys are still living. Myself and my younger brother are the only boys that's living out of that class.
Well, that's still a pretty good record for being that many years ago.
Yes, let me see, that was in 1930, and that would be 58 years, wouldn't it?
58 years ago, the first graduating class of Summertown High School. Well, Mr. Bottom, we're going to have to interrupt again. We'll have another word from our sponsor, and we'll be back in 1 minute. We're back with Mr. Bottoms talking about the early school life in Summertown. During the commercial break, Mr. Bottoms, you said something about a quarantine in the community during the senior year of your first graduating class. How about expounding on this a little bit?
To me, as a high school graduate that I had been looking forward to so long, and I think the rest of the class too, it really became a tragedy. We had a large part of our community, maybe all of it, was quarantined due to a smallpox epidemic that we had here. And instead of having night services where we would have speakers and we would do this and that they always do at graduation exercises, that was all out. Some of the seniors that graduated were not even present, but we had just part of the school day services that we had here. That is all they'd allow us to do. We got our diplomas. We were really happy about it, and one or two of them was at home in bed sick, and we carried the diplomas to them. But that ruined it in a way. It was kind of bad because we had looked forward to it so much, so long, but that's the way it turned out.
So as hard as it was to go through your 12 years of school or thereabouts, when you came to the end of the line, there was more problems. Problems never cease, I suppose.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well, Mr. Bottoms, our time has expired in this segment. Seems like we're discussing the school life of Summertown. It's really interesting discussion we're carrying on. So we're going to take up the next episode with Mr. Bottoms, a school teacher and principal and so forth. If you're interested in being a part of this program or have any information that might be of interest to the viewing public, we ask that you contact either Charles Mabry or Eddie Talley. And until next time, this is Focus on Summertown. Series about Summertown, both past and present. Summertown's had many faces over the years. At one time, Summertown was known as a summer resort. I think that's where it got its name. And Summertown was known as a railroad hub. It was also known as a small mining town. And as most of us that come to know Summertown, is a quiet, sleepy little community. In this series, we're discussing several different subjects. We're going to discuss subjects from the early layout of the community to the schools of the community, which is what we're discussing now, and also the churches of the community, and some of the older families that lived around Summertown in the 20s, 30s, and the 1940s. And also going to discuss some of the people who made the news back in the early days. And today we're exploring the early school life in Summertown. We've been talking with Mr. Bottoms. Mr. Flavil Bottoms is with us. And Mr. Bottoms, welcome back to our show again.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Bottoms, on the first show, he talked about the early school life in Summertown, the early buildings, and the school life up until the first graduating class in Summertown, which Mr. Bottoms was a part of. Mr. Bottoms, after you graduated from high school, where did you go from there?
About the first 2 years I was in college. I went to Middle Tennessee State Teachers College, it was called then, at Murfreesboro. And after finishing 2 years there, I applied for a school in Lawrence County, and I was given the Goss School, which is down towards Napier.
About what year was this, Mr. Bottoms?
That was 1933. 1933. I taught at Goss 1 year, and then they gave me Center, which was a 2-teacher school, 3 miles closer home. Was an up-and-coming community, I thought, and it really was. And then they moved me closer to home by giving me the Freedom School then. It was my 3rd year. Mr. Bill Hazelwood, Uncle Bill we called him, was the board member at that time, an elderly man who was retired from his work. He was undertaker at one time at Summertown and also had a blacksmith shop. Uncle Bill was his whole heart and soul seemed to be interested in the school system throughout the county, and it was mainly what he lived for. But he soon as he passed away, Mr. Roy Martin was elected to the board.
Mr. Roy Martin, this was, let's relate Mr. Martin to the people that we know now.
That most of the people around here are still remember Claude Martin. It was his father. He was I don't know how long the Martins lived here, but it was a long time. They were certainly here before the 20s. And Mr. Martin said to me one time, he said, "Bottoms, I'll tell you, since you did pretty well out at Gauss Center, if you'll do all right over at Freedom, I'll let you teach at Summertown the next year. So you can just bet I went after it."
He gave you the incentive to come to Summertown.
He sure did. He gave me the incentive. Mr. Martin was a businessman and was interested in the schools, and he liked to see the schools make a lot of progress. And we were fortunate to have Mr. Martin as a school board member. Later, I saw the necessity of getting more college work, and I taught here, I guess it was 35 and 36, and then I stayed out and went back to school. Went back to Murfreesboro, and then I was made principal of the elementary school when I came back. The new high school then, which was located just west of the elementary school, was built, I guess in 37, and they moved out, lock, stock, and barrel. We had no library. The old gymnasium. The old gymnasium was actually the two north rooms of the old Ader School. We took out the partition between those two rooms there, where Mr. Turpin, that was one of his rooms, and Miss Carrie Dooley was the other room. We tore that partition out, and we fixed it up as well as we could. If you could shoot goals if you didn't arch the ball too high, but if you went too high with the ball, it'd hit the ceiling and come down before it got there.
Probably had about a 15-foot ceiling with a 10-foot goal.
That's right. Now there was a great need for a gymnasium, a great need, because we had eager boys and girls that wanted to play ball and very little space to play in. So that was the time of the WPA, and it was proposed, and I don't know who was the leader in that, it was proposed that the government would furnish the labor if we, the community or county, or both of them, together would furnish the material for the gymnasium.
All right, we're talking about lumber. Lumber's hard to come by. Money was hard to come by. So how did we come out?
Now, we borrowed the money from Mr. Lowell Crane's father, who was a ran a general store here and was magistrate here in the county. But I neglected to mention just prior to that, though, we did get a new elementary school built here, which we were proud of, until it burned about 1956, 55 or 6. We got that with the aid and assistance of the people of the community who contributed money. So we applied that same thing to the building of the new gymnasium here, which is still standing. It's in need of repair and I hope that we can get some repair work done and not have to tear that building down, because it is a substantial building and should serve the elementary school of our area here for many, many years to come.
That's our elementary school gymnasium,
That's
and
right.
it's the only inside facilities that the elementary school has to have their phys ed classes in bad weather.
That's right. I would certainly like to see that building taken care of. I don't think it'll take too much finances to put it back in good shape, and I do believe that with proper leadership in our community among the PTA and other patrons, that we could get some assistance maybe from the community to help that finance that the remedial work that needs to be done there in that building.
All right, that gym is approximately, what we say, 50 years old, something in the area?
Yes, it's about 52 years old.
Okay, when the gym was built, who was the overseers of this? I know the WPA did the work, and explain a little bit about the financing and these aspects of building this gym.
As I remember it, Mr. Will Black, who lived up until just a few years ago, he passed away, was the foreman for the construction of that building. And they used local carpenters, people from this end of the county. The WPA, the government financed the labor part of it. That was a great help to the unemployed of our area at that time, and also it was furnishing a building that was greatly needed, but it left us at the end of the construction there. It left us, the teachers of the schools here, indebted or signers of the note to Mr. L.W. Crane, Linwood Crane.
All right, we're going to have to interrupt just a minute, Mr. Bottoms. We're going to have a word from our sponsors. We'll be back in 1 minute. As we were left, Mr. Bottoms, you were talking about the teachers seem to be indebted to Mr. Crane for the school.
Yes. Well, when the high school got their new building and they moved out, it seemed that they felt that they were no longer obligated for the payment of the old gym, since they had a new gym with the new building that had been constructed. Now, that left us, the elementary school, which was then separate from the high school. Originally we had one principal who was principal of both the high and the elementary, but now once it moved out, then they elected a principal of the elementary school, which was me at that time. Now, I felt this responsibility very keenly, and I talked to several of the teachers about it, and they felt that we were in an impossible situation. Now, we couldn't make money with plays because elementary schools just don't make money with plays. We don't make money with basketball games. So we had a problem. We had problems even paying the interest on the note. So someone suggested that we have a square dance. Well, most of us here in our elementary school were members of various churches in this community. Well, now I knew that wouldn't go over very well with the churches, but we were between a rock and a hard place. So, with the help of some of the outsiders, we organized a square dance. You know, one of the first things that I had to buy that I didn't know was used as a square dance, and that was cornmeal.
What did you use cornmeal for, the square dance?
Sir, we spread the cornmeal on the floor, and when you the dancing and the walking on it polished the floor. Oh, it made a beautiful floor. Now I believe we charged $2.50 per couple. Well, we had, I guess, about 2 dances.
What was we trying to raise? About $1,200, $1,400, something like that?
interest and all run nearly $2,000.
This was what year?
This was in 1937, I believe it was. And now the problems were great for us. Now that is a lot of money. Back in those days, that was a lot of money.
Yeah, money was scarce.
That's
Scarce as chicken teeth, we might say.
Now this, not only getting in bad with your church, but this Dances was not getting enough cash. So I spent a lot of time worrying about that. One time I said to Bucket Holloway, I said, do you suppose there's any way that we could get the county to assume this indebtedness? He said, I don't know. That's a lot to ask of them, and they don't have much money. So that wasn't much help. So I go down. I knew Judge Lindsay. I have a personal visit with him. He was very sympathetic. He said, now we'll see what we can do, but I'll tell you what, I'm having some magistrates in here next week, next Wednesday, I believe it is, and you just come on down here and bring some of your friends down with you, and they won't know you're coming, and I won't either. You just come on in, and we'll make a little room for you. So I got Bucket Holloway, and I can't remember, it seemed like there's one or two more went with us, and we went down to the judge's office, and he introduced us to the rest of the court. And
Big surprise of you coming in.
Big surprise. And he asked me if I had something to say, and I said, yes, I believe I have. So I talked to him a few minutes about the predicament we were in here, and I just came out plain, and I said, what I came down here for is to get the county court to appropriate enough money to take over this indebtedness. And there wasn't, as I remember it, there wasn't a single member of the county court that opened their mouth. But the judge looked sort of pleased, and he smiled at us, and we left. It wasn't but a few days till the court passed a resolution to assume the indebtedness here. Now that was a problem. That was a load off of our minds, and I believe that was 1937.
That $2,000 being off the indebtedness really was a load off your mind, I'm sure. And the judge pulled politics, as we might say, and took care of the situation.
Yes, he did. I always appreciated him for that, because I don't think he ever really knew, and I'm sure the county court didn't know really how it was affecting us teachers, because nearly all of us were making less than $1,000 a year. And of that $1,000 a year, most of us were having to spend some of that money to go back to school during the summer to further our education. So we were not loaded with money. So it was helpful to us, and it was certainly appreciated.
Well, that takes care of the the elementary gym. And the early board members, how many board members, do you remember how many board members we had at that time on a school board? Of course, we're talking about the county court there, but do you remember, did we have a school board at that time, or did it come in later?
Yes, we had school board members at that time. I believe there was 9 in the county. They were representing various areas of the county, beginning with the south end and the middle district, Lawrenceburg and Etheridge and Summertown. Our first board member was Mr. Hazelwood, and then after his death was Mr. Roy Martin, and later Mr. Edward Davis. Now, Mr. Walter Alexander was the board member of Board of Education when the new gym here was built, and I suppose. Now, this building here has been built onto so many times, I don't remember. But it seems to me like a part of it was reworked this past year.
Yeah, this new gym that we have, our high school gym, was built in the early 1950s.
Well, that's about right. Yes. And I believe Mr. Walter Alexander was board member here.
All right, Mr. Alexander, I guess he resided in Alexander Springs, I guess, right in that area,
yes,
Three Oaks
that's
area.
Where he lived. We had a good we've had a good school. We've had a good PTA that encouraged the teachers, the elementary teachers of especially over the years, which I think's been helpful for our schools.
Yeah, the PTA is a worthy organization that helps in schools. Nowadays, if you don't have some money project, you can't hardly get through the school year because the county don't have the money to appropriate for the little things that you need to operate the school. I remember when I was in school in the 50s and the early 60s that the PTA was a thriving organization.
Yes, yes. Well, it's helpful in a lot of ways. It encourages your teachers. Your teachers know they've got some support that otherwise they wouldn't know, and they feel more secure in the things that they're doing, and they get advice and counsel from the PTA that's quite helpful too.
Okay, it's time for another word from our sponsor. We'll be back in 1 minute. All right, Mr. Bottoms, we've got the elementary school built. We've got all of our school buildings built, seems like. Do you remember the names of some of the principals that has been in Summertown over the years other than yourself?
Yes, I remember Miss Hannah Staggs followed me in the elementary school, and then Miss Ruby O'Rear for a number of years, and then Sid James until more recently. And in the high school, Noah Turpin was principal from 30 through 32 for about 3 years. Mr. Raymond McCrory was principal from 33 and 34 school years, or 2 years. Lowell Crane came here in 35 through 43, I believe it was, for about 9 years. And then A.D. Chapman was here from 44 through 53 for about 10 years. And Mr. Vinson came here in 54 through 78, or 25 years with the high school. I think Mr. Vinson came here the year that the first brick elementary and high school together burned. There was 2 distinct buildings at that time, and Mr. Vinson was here for many, many years and got to enjoy the beautiful new gymnasium that was built during that time. And the high school was making great progress, and it's amazing to me as I look at what they've got here, and I think back and compare it with my days at the great progress that this high school has made. It makes me proud of our community.
Well, Mr. Bottoms, we've been glad to have you as our guest, and I think you've thoroughly discussed and covered the school system of Summertown over the years, some before we have come to know it and some afterwards. And as you see, we've been discussing these school years, and there has been so much improvement in the school buildings and school system over the last 50 years. As you can see now, we're sitting in the library of the Summertown High School, which is an immense building with shelves full of books. And we have computers nowadays, and everything's regulated by computers, and we have multiple teachers, a lot more than Mr. Bottoms had whenever he started.
Oh my, yes.
So I think this has been an interesting discussion, Mr. Bottoms, and we're certainly glad that you have been with us. And if you're interested in being a part of this program, or if you have any information that might be of interest to the viewing public, we ask that you contact either Charlie Mabry or Eddie Talley. And until next time, this is Focus on Summertown.